experimental jazz concepts. So last week I just went over more things that were kind of coming out of free jazz music and avant-garde music, specifically of the 1960s. So today is kind of a deep dive into for what a lot of people with jazz backgrounds might be a very, very new thing for a lot of people. And I'll provide context of, okay, if I'm talking about jazz concepts, why am I talking about contemporary classical music today? With my opening slide, the great John Hollenbeck. So I was fortunate enough in about 2005 to catch a masterclass with John Hollenbeck and the Claudia Quintet back at James Madison University in Virginia during my undergraduate. And one of the really main things that kind of stuck with me with this masterclass was basically Hollenbeck talking about how jazz musicians and composers should basically study 20th century and 21st century music in order to get new ideas for jazz composition. And just in a way, he mentioned how basically jazz music or modern jazz is still trying to catch up with some of these ideas and techniques that are coming from contemporary classical music in that world. And I think at the time he didn't even really go into maybe that much detail about like which composers to check out or specifically how you transfer one to another. But for me, it kind of opened up this door where I was really only listening to, like ECM records and hard bop and just, different things within the jazz tradition. So this opened up a whole new world of sound and composition for just me personally. So just if anyone out there wants to kind of get deeper into this and what this sounds like, John Hollenbeck has a group, Claudia Quintet. That's all of his original music for this just really interesting quintet of musicians. And then I actually attended a master class earlier this year during COVID that Anna Weber gave, who is John Hollenbeck's copyist and an incredible saxophonist, flautist, composer. And she has this newer record, Clockwise, from the last few years. And in this masterclass from earlier this year, she talked about the exact same thing, basically getting a group of musicians together for this project and then listening to all these really specific contemporary classical music pieces and finding different things she could take from uh, cello music or solo percussion music and kind of take ideas and write her own music out of that for her ensemble. Her record Clockwise is just an incredible album to also check out to get deeper into this. So basically today, one of the main things I wanted to kind of go over as quickly as I can is some of the different pieces that are out there, some of the things that I personally have gotten ideas from or found attachment from. In order to kind of construct my own music or again just to get new ideas. And so I wanted to start also, by the way, none of these scores are in any specific order. I just kind of started throwing stuff into this PowerPoint, so whatever comes out comes out. So this is Cornelius Cardew. He was an incredible British composer, primarily working in the like 1960s, 1970s. And one of his sort of main compositions was this incredible 198 graphic score called Treatise. And the idea behind this score is, and that's just 2 pages of the score, is that you see this graphic notation and nowhere in the beginning or the end of the score are there any text instructions or any key or any notes on basically what to do with this graphic music and how to interpret it or what some of the different symbols mean. And then loosely, this is based on the philosopher Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico Philosophicus treatise. And so, one of those main ideas that comes from this philosophical treatise, and I am really overly simplifying and dumbing this down right now, but is this basic concept of looking outside your window at a tree and what different people would look at a tree and how they would respond to it. So for me, I could look at that and say that's a tree. Someone who's Spanish speaking, arbol, French speaking, arbre. Sorry, butchering pronunciation here. So someone who speaks a different language would call it, something in their own language. Someone could look at it and think plants, wood, leaves, part of a forest. And so it's this idea that basically we ascribe personal ideas attached to different symbols that we see. And so that's the overarching idea with this graphic score is you could put the same page in front of 12 different improvisers who are trying to very seriously navigate and play this graphic music, and you could have 12 completely different interpretations, even if you, after somebody improvised on one of these scores, were to stop and actually say, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is how I'm thinking about the circles, this is what I'm thinking about the triangles, etc., etc. um, and so that's kind of the point of the piece, is that the graphics end up being whatever you make of it. And so I just thought this was kind of a very eye-opening idea with graphic notation, because when you're using graphics to ascribe musical ideas, there's a lot of ways to do it, and this is sort of this open-ended way of like, okay, here's some symbols, in good faith, try to do what you can to sort of interpret that. So anyway, starting off with treaties, and then I wanted to skip over to another thing that Cardew was involved with that I also think really are some really incredible ideas for an ensemble of improvisers. So back in the late 60s, early 70s, Cardew had a British group of musicians called the Scratch Music Orchestra, and basically everyone within the orchestra wrote pieces for the group. And most of the pieces were these little graphic pieces, text pieces, sometimes using traditional notation, and just kind of anything goes. One of the main aesthetics of this group was, if you were writing a piece for the band, the idea was the piece was either a solo composition to be performed as like you're playing a solo in an ensemble, or a composition written with the idea in mind that you're accompanying some other solo that's happening in the group. So basically, just a really basic idea. Your composition is a solo, or your composition is an accompaniment. Um, so there's a few things, here on the right that are just some different small scratch pieces that the group would play. So on the right bottom there, Howard Skimpton has a piece, drum number 1. Any number of drums, introduction of pulse, continuation of pulse, deviation through emphasis, decoration, contradiction. So that could be a solo piece, that could be a accompaniment piece. And then right next to it, 4 strings, waves, shingle, seagulls. So just whoever the string player is has to play that, and whatever that means. Um, and this group kind of eventually got into more performance art. They have one scratch piece that's literally talking about uh, piece of sand by piece of sand physically moving an island from one location to another. So it gets into these more performance art and theoretical concepts that are really not applicable to actually creating real lifetime results, but just this very kind of interesting practice. And so, how I've kind of applied this before with improvising ensembles myself is I took a collection of these previously existing scratch pieces, and I kind of edited together a collection of these original scores that were the ones that were the most non-theoretical. So things that an ensemble could actually play, and pieces that kind of interact with one another, because there's some instructions about, like, only play when the person to your left is not playing, or specific instructions of how to accompany these musicians that are making music around you. And then going a little bit further, then once I had like an ensemble of improvising musicians try these things out, then I gave them all pen and paper and had them basically just sketch out these quick little pieces and pass them around to one another, where basically people are writing these very short little compositions in the moment, and everyone's kind of improvising. So it kind of creates this sort of collage style music where everyone's interacting and composing and arranging on the spot, and just kind of creates this sound of all these different things happening. So anyway, I just think there's a lot to this concept and idea of sort of creating this group composed music. And to take this a little further, the Instant Composers Pool, which is this Dutch group of improvisers with Misha Mingelberg and Han Bennick, they've done a lot of similar things with this, where the notated music is a lot of ostinatos and vamps and repeated ideas. And then while they're playing these ostinatos, then other people in the ensemble are writing out background figures, are writing out compositions for one another to play while the ostinato is kind of happening. So moving forward, this was an idea that I really got a lot of great stuff out of. And after I talk about this, I'm going to play a little bit of audio here. But George Lewis is great AACM trombonist, composer, electronic musician. This is a piece from the late 1970s. The score on the right is just one page of the score. This is for a multiple instrument group. So there's a saxophone group, a brass group, a percussion group, a bass group, a piano group, and they all have these 4x4 grids with instructions. Um, so in the key for this, every improviser who's in their own group starts at the top, reads it left to right, top to bottom, as if you're reading like a book or a paragraph, but with the grids. And then there's any number of players. It can be a solo piece, it can be a full orchestra piece. uh, each box is played basically 10 to 5 to 10 seconds, and then you pause at least twice as long in between each grid. um, so that basically if you have an ensemble of musicians playing this, it's not super cacophonous and there's not all this stuff happening at once. There's nice space between all of the improvisers who are playing. So the triangles that are written in is just a sign for open improvisation. And that might be similar to how Anthony Braxton thinks of that with some of his own graphic notation. The performers have to have basically a tape recorder, which the modern version is you could have your iPhone with the speaker turned up, and then also a secondary instrument, because there are notes within these scores to change instruments. And then there's also notes about copy an event, which is just you hear a sound somewhere in the ensemble and then you immediately imitate it. um, as this piece, could potentially be a larger piece for like a full orchestra, then there's more notes about using even more silences between each box grid idea. Um, so yeah, there's a lot that can kind of happen with this, but I really liked this idea of basically having this organized grid of sound ideas and having different ways musicians could jump around the grid, even though this one specifies left to right, top to bottom. And so I definitely have stolen this idea to kind of create improvisational spaces for different musicians, and having very different ideas kind of within the grid. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this so you can kind of hear what this sounds like. Yeah, so anyway, yeah, you can hear kind of the sparse sort of letting sounds be sounds kind of approach to this ensemble. And yeah, just some, again, interesting ways to figure out this kind of way to write for improvisers. Moving forward, at CU Boulder, this last year, we had Roscoe Mitchell work with the students over several sessions doing these virtual Zoom sessions. And so I just have scanned a couple of cards of the guitar cards. So basically, however many years ago, Roscoe Mitchell, who's the saxophonist of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, he kind of I think had enough situations playing with beginner improvisers and specifically like free improvisers that he decided he wanted to start basically notating out these cards to give younger improvisers or people who aren't familiar with open improvisation basically some rules and some ideas of some things to play to kind of figure out how to get into this music. And so um, he kind of created this series of pieces, which all have different titles and are all for different instrumentation and orchestration. Um, but I can't remember exactly where these guitar cards come from. But they can be played as a solo. They can be played with an ensemble. So the idea is that each line from each page is an individual phrase, and that basically you can mix and match these phrases. So this is page one and page two just next to each other, left and right. And so you could read it like a traditional music score, starting at the top, going down, then go to the second page, start at the top, go down. Or you could put a bunch of cards next to one another and read it left to right on all the pages, then move to the second line, read it all left to right through all the pages, because it's just these chunks of individual phrases. So then when he worked with us using kind of this kind of material of these short melodic ideas, the big thing with the context of playing this with an ensemble was really listening through the group for the right moments of when you would enter to play a phrase and then also how you would end the phrases, making sure you know how if you were holding a note longer or what your cutoff was like, that it all kind of made sense within the ensemble atmosphere. And so when he himself kind of first started doing this, he actually had a project with trumpet player Hugh Reagan and the percussionist Tyshawn Sorey, where they were doing some of these things as a trio. And so, what Hugh Reagan had mentioned to us, what had happened was they got together for maybe a day or two and really rehearsed these cards, played them all day, really got into the nuts and bolts of it. Roscoe was like being really specific about how they were doing it and making sure everything was how he was hearing it. And then the idea was they went into the recording studio and then completely just basically threw the cards away and then just did complete open improvisation with the idea and the gesture of what these cards had um, how they had been written and how the musical material lie. Uh, uh, so it was this really interesting process, which kind of got me thinking about this idea of like having musicians like play some kind of specifically notated music and learn a system and a structure of composed music, but then later after rehearsing and working with them on that, then completely just doing open improvisation with sort of the memory of these gestures and the thinking about these things that had kind of come before that you had worked on. So then almost paradoxically, then when Roscoe was talking about the idea of playing open improvisation and free improvisation removed from these notated cards, one of the things he really specified was basically if you have a 5-person ensemble, it should never sound like one person is soloing and the others are accompanying, or even really sounding like there is accompaniment going on. In his mind, if you have 5 improvisers that are playing this kind of openly improvised music, it should actually sound like 5 people soloing at once. And he actually, and this is what Hugh Reagan has kind of mentioned, he actually gets upset if it sounds like someone is specifically listening to another musician and trying to play off of their ideas and trying to accompany them, because he prefers it if it sounds more I guess not random, but just more individualistic than that. which kind of makes me want to go back and check out a lot of these art ensemble of Chicago recordings with that idea in mind, that they're sort of consciously not trying to maybe accompany one another. They're just all playing within the same space, trying to kind of contribute, ideas to what's happening. So yeah, a little bit on Roscoe. I'll play a little bit of this, but John Cage was very openly not into jazz and not really into improvisation either. But I do feel like he snuck in a few pieces throughout his career that happen to be decent pieces for improvisers, or that kind of open up the door to improvise music. Towards the end of his life, he was doing these stopwatch timing pieces where every musician within the ensemble had a stopwatch next to their score, and would meticulously follow these timings with how their entrances and exits were. And so just physically looking at the score, basically the timings give you parameters of when you start and stop playing. So at the very top left, number two, you start playing somewhere between 0 seconds and a minute 15, and you stop playing somewhere between 55 seconds and 2 minutes and 5 seconds. But then those timings overlap with the next event. So that overlaps number two with event number four, and so forth and so forth. And so before you would go in to play like this score, 4/6, every member of the quartet, because it's a piece for four musicians, every musician has a different stopwatch timing score. You basically would write out in advance 12 musical ideas. So 12 different sounds with fixed characteristics. And each one of those 12 sounds are specifically numbered. So for me as a bass player, number two could be like pizzicato in the low register. Number four could be arco harmonics. Number nine could be knocking with your fingers on the wood of the bass. So giving yourself these really specific ideas on your instrument, and 12 of them, so that then when you're playing through the score, you have specific timings of when you play each idea and for how long. Um, uh, and there is a lot of flexibility, not only with whatever the 12 sounds are that you come up with and write out for yourself to kind of play and improvise on, but then obviously with how this is notated with all these different open timings, there's a lot of possibilities of when you're going to start and stop. So you could pretty much end up playing almost the entire piece once you start playing, or you could play for very small chunks of like 10 or 20 seconds if you're following the score properly and leaving a lot of silences. Um, so when you end up playing something like this with a quartet with other improvisers who have other timings, it ends up creating this interesting space where there's times where people are playing solo and people are playing duo, trio, quartet, but it's almost written out in this really remarkable rhythmic and phrasing kind of pattern where nobody really knows what's going to happen because all four of the scores are different. All four of the performers are making different decisions. And it just creates this sort of radical approach to like aleatoric phrasing, where these different things are kind of coming in and out of one another. And so, especially for open improvisers or for jazz improvisers, I wouldn't recommend everyone go out and get stopwatches and only play music like this, but it really opens up your eyes to the different possibilities within an ensemble of how you can layer musicians in and out in different ways, where it doesn't have to always be everyone playing at once. It doesn't always have to be like a duo for a really long time or a trio for a long time. You can have this much more varied gradation between your orchestration of your ensemble with improvisers. So again, real quick, I want to play a little bit of audio, and I'll talk about this a little bit here in a minute. But this is an interpretation of this piece by the band Sonic Youth. Yeah, so you can kind of hear how there's these like really specific sound ideas that are happening like within, that band, and how each idea is only lasting 10, 20, 30 seconds, and they're all kind of coming in and out at different times. And they're actually, I feel like, almost is like an electronic element, where even if you have like, just normal acoustic instrumentation for like a piece like this, it almost sort of sounds like a Pro Tools file, where you have, these four instruments and these little blocks of sound that are sort of sitting in this space and kind of interacting or not with one another. So you can almost see like the DAW of these musical ideas coming in and out. And yeah, it would be very easy to create something like this in a program like that. All right. So I'm not going to talk about too much of this, but I just wanted to add this in. A lot of my study of this kind of music is coming from like the music of like text music and text pieces from the 20th century. And so one of the first ones of its kind was Stockhausen has this series of 15 text pieces called From the 7 Days. So just one of these pieces, right durations. Play a sound, play it for so long until you feel that you should stop. Again, play a sound, play it so long until you feel that you should stop, and so on. Stop when you feel that you should stop. But whether you play or stop, keep listening to the others. At best, play when people are listening. And then at the very bottom, do not rehearse. Which I like that. That's kind of a, I don't know, funny addendum at the end. And so this sort of started off this genre of intuitive music, which, to be honest, I haven't really checked out that much. But there's, I think, a whole website. I'd have to find the link for it. But there's a whole website online of a giant collection of scores over the last 50 years of different composers that have written music within this intuitive music genre. And a lot of it's kind of open source, like easy to find, and a lot of very text based music for, musicians that don't even necessarily need to be trained musicians, but then can just follow these sort of instructive pieces. So part of this music is, it's a process music. It's musical improvisation based on instant creation, in which fixed principles or rules may or may not have been given. So basically, these kind of open form, open structure sort of pieces that sometimes are just almost suggestions more than anything else. Um, and although this is kind of synonymous with open improvisation and free improvisation, Stockhausen himself didn't like using the word improvisation for any of his music or compositions, because to him, improvisation, I think, had too many specific hangups with the terminology, where in his world, improvisation implied a certain kind of genre or style, or just rules that were already attached to the idea of what improvisation is or is not. And if I had to guess, especially since this is from the late 60s, probably improvisation being tied to the world of jazz. And so him trying to find a way to kind of talk about this music or this idea without specifically having to invoke like a jazz tradition. Um, and then I think, just as a fun fact, I believe this also was written when maybe he was in the middle of like a 7 day fast. And so he just, didn't eat for a week and was just kind of going a little crazy and writing out this new kind of text based music. And so it's a little bit of a wild period in his career. Um, this is another one. So this gets back to Sonic Youth. So the reason I played the earlier recording is, there's just this incredible album that Sonic Youth made in November of 1999 called Goodbye 20th Century, and it's a bunch of 20th century compositions and music, some of which they had picked that had already previously been written, some of which was written specifically for this recording session, but they had a few extra musicians added on to the ensemble, and basically played an entire record's worth of 20th century contemporary classical music. So one of which they also did on the recording was this piece by James Tenney called Having Never Written a Note for Percussion, originally written for the percussionist John Bergamo. And so as you can see with this text graphic, all the piece really is just an incredibly long crescendo and decrescendo. The original recording and performance practice is to basically do this for about 10 to 20 minutes on a large gong. So I've never actually heard a performance of the original like gong piece, but I've heard it's just amazing. Just hearing the whole overtone series and structure of exactly that, an incredibly long crescendo and decrescendo for this highly complex percussive instrument. And so Sonic Youth took this to the next level, which other improvisers have done since then, which is, okay, this is written for a gong, but what if we do this for improvisers? So take just the idea of we're going to, be an improvising ensemble, and maybe there's some kind of conducting or stopwatches or some kind of way to sort of frame it, or do it organically and try to do a incredibly long crescendo decrescendo where the first few minutes are basically almost inaudible, getting up to the point of having everyone in the ensemble wear earplugs just to get it like as loud as possible. And then that brings this idea of like, okay, so if you're doing that, then what kind of music are you playing? What sort of things are you doing on your instruments to create this dynamic macro structure? So this is from a series of compositions that Tenney referred to as postal pieces. He also nicknamed them scorecards, but it's all these pieces that are written on just a single postcard. And there's a lot of these are just these meditations on these single performance gestures. A lot of these pieces are just solo pieces. But again, just by my kind of bigger point of the whole lecture today is just by trying to find some of this sort of more experimental and contemporary music to just get ideas of how you can create these environments and gestures for improvisers, whether they're things you would want to play at a concert live for people, or they're just exercises that you would want to do in rehearsal to try to come into new spaces. I've kind of looked at this as sort of both aspects of trying to get together with people and play these things just purely for fun, but then also, at least in my world, how can I steal some of these ideas? How can I take some of these things from some of these compositions and find ways to make it, make some of these gestures pop up in my own music, in my own different filters and ways. But it's all about, again, this lecture today, how you can kind of learn about more music outside of just your traditional jazz idiom and figure out ways to get deeper into composition and improvisation and the connection between the two. All right, so it's video time here. So I wanted to talk just very, very briefly about Cobra. Before I say anything about it, I was just going to play this short couple-minute video. Because this is something I've had probably more luck bringing to improvisers than anything else to try to, again, open up kind of the world of new ideas and structures to specifically jazz improvisers. So I'm just going to play a few minutes from this video from the 1980s of Zorn talking about it.
I think in blocks, in changing blocks of sound. And in that sense, one possible block is a genre of music. Pop music, jazz music, classical music, blues music, hardcore music. They're all blocks that can be ordered and reordered the way the 12 pitches in the chromatic scale can be ordered and reordered. And Cobra is a really great example because most of the changes happen with downbeats, and it's very clear when you hear the blocks moving. Well, Cobra itself the title comes from a war game. My early game pieces were just sports like lacrosse, hockey, pool, fencing. And I got bored with those names and I started using war games, like these kind of bookshelf games that a company like Avalon Hill made.
At a recording session, An ensemble of improvisers brought together by Zorn prepares to perform his music. It's more training than rehearsal. What they play, the actual sounds they make, will hardly be mentioned. Zorn directs them in how he wants them to communicate with him and with each other.
The scene that I basically grew up in was a scene of improvisers who improvised in different degrees and with their own different talents. Everybody kind of grew through playing with each other and through listening to different things and created a very particular way of approaching their instrument. What I was really fascinated with was finding a way to harness these people's talents in a compositional framework without actually hindering what they did best, which is improvising. Finding a way to have them work in a group that created a kind of a shape or a kind of a sound that could be identified with what I was interested in, which is changing blocks of sound, but at the same time which didn't limit their imagination, which never told them what to do.
The cards are Zorn's way of signaling a variety of options available to the players, choices affecting the different ways in which the musicians relate to each other.
It means that as it goes around, let's say it's here, Spelios, you have this amount of time before it comes to you again. You can make eye contact with anybody else in the band as it comes around and say, when it's my turn to play, you play with me. When it's your turn, whoever you cued will come in with you. Then it will continue to go around again.
Yeah, so I could play more of that, but I want to try to get into some other things here. Just to kind of briefly get into it. So this gets into basically music as a game, and Zorn's not the first person to do this, but basically, as I've heard in a different interview about Cobra and some of his game pieces, what had happened with this new generation of improvisers from like the late 70s, early 80s was that they were kind of trying to figure out a way to create new improvised music that was sort of doing away with the older free jazz, like late Coltrane, Cecil Taylor approach of like loud, dense, long improvised music that happened for a lot of time, kind of in the same sort of dynamic register and range. And so Zorn created these game pieces to kind of figure out a way to break that up. And with him, he comes from a background of film music and studying a lot of film composers, and then eventually doing film composition himself. And so that's why he got into this idea of like cells or blocks of sound, so that with these cards, when you give a downbeat with a card, it's usually an immediate change of sound. So it could be a trombonist playing solo, and then a downbeat, and then the entire ensemble just playing wild and free, and then another downbeat, and it's a piano and a guitar duet. So that each time there's a downbeat, there's a radical change of music, instead of sort of like, I guess, the natural gradual approach that could happen with open improvisation. So it's really just, again, coming up with new structures to get around that. And then literally with Cobra, it actually does eventually become a game as you learn more and more rules, where there becomes like a spy, and the spy can take over the game from the conductor, and there's a guerrilla takeover. And I mean, it really does quite literally get into a game of people who are kind of like winning, even though there's all this musical activity that's sort of happening throughout. But anyway, I would highly recommend checking out the rest of that video if you can. I've taught Cobra at this point to literally hundreds of musicians over the years, so I'm always happy to get in more detail with how that music works. Yeah. So Christian Wolff is one of the most important composers to me, and one of the first people who was really writing new music in the 20th century that sort of is this in between the cracks, not quite contemporary classical music, not quite jazz, not quite improvised music, but all of those things, but none of those things. Um, a good example, for instance, is he has a quintet video performance from several years back from Roulette, and it's mostly contemporary classical musicians that are within his ensemble, but then Joey Barron is playing drum set. And so it's cool because it's like, again, it's jazz, but it's not really jazz. It's somewhere just in the middle. So one of the things that Wolf and John Cage and some of the other composers back in like the 1940s and 1950s had decided was, with the music that they were composing and writing, really the main thing they were trying to get at was getting rid of the glue of musical composition that was melody, harmony, and rhythm. So asking this very tough question of what is musical composition if you're trying to specifically deal with other elements than melody, harmony, rhythm. And so it really creates like a whole new artistic and aesthetic headspace of trying to get into music making and making sound when you're dealing with other parameters than melody, harmony, and rhythm. And then just read this quote here real quick. One day I said to myself that it would be better to get rid of all that melody, rhythm, harmony. This was not a negative thought, and it had not meant that it was necessary to avoid them, but rather that while doing something else would appear spontaneously. We had to liberate ourselves from the direct and preemptory consequence of attention and effect, because intention would always be out on own and would be circumscribed when so many other forces are evidently in action in the final effect. So anyway, a little bit about what they're trying to do. So one of the pieces that early on that Wolf wrote that was kind of going against this paradigm was this piece called Edges. And so what you see below is basically the main score is the graphic on the top, and the bottom score is just the key to how to interpret that graphic. It's just what all the different symbols mean. And so this was written for a group of improvisers called the AMM that were mostly non-trained improvisers, like a lot of art school students who played instruments but never actually learned how to read traditional music. And so Wolf wrote this composition specifically for this band, knowing like this is something that non-trained musicians can learn to play without actually learning traditional notation. So the idea is once you learn what these symbol means, you look at the score, you're basically playing the top score, but you're playing it as if basically it's a map. So you visualize yourself physically in the space. So for instance, you could be like left of number 3, and you are slowly moving from number 3 to the left, and then you're playing those 4 symbols that are to the left of number 3, and then you move there to another place in the score. So just kind of imagine like you're a little person that's kind of physically moving in this space. As Wolf has described this before, actually what you're also seeing is the negative of like a photograph. So basically you're trying to play the opposites of what's written. So if you're around the number 3, you're supposed to actually play the opposite of number 3, and then you're supposed to get close to playing a number 3. But the whole idea is you're not actually supposed to literally play the symbols, because the piece is edges. You're supposed to play the edges of all these musical ideas, or the opposite of the music ideas, or the degrees between these different ideas. And so again, it really gets you into this different headspace of, well, what is the number 3? How can I interpret the number 3 musically? What's the opposite of number 3 musically? What gets close to playing that? And you could get into rhythmic ideas, dynamic ideas, pitch ideas, harmonic ideas. Could be something to do with triads, could be something to do with intervals. But with something like this, the more you think about it and the more you really focus on what these are and kind of come up with concepts for it, it becomes almost like a limitless piece. And a true kind of realization also would involve quite a few silences and kind of sparse sounds, because if you physically look at the score, there's a lot of open space, and that's supposed to be kind of interpreted by the performers laying out and not constantly playing. Just like the score itself, you know, there are notations, but it's not like a lot of things on the page at once. um, but yeah, really interesting piece. Again, I've done this with improvisers over the years, and after, you know, a 5 or 10 minute sort of short rehearsal and pointing out some of these things to people, it's very quickly, you know, easy to get people to kind of latch onto. So another piece by Christian Wolff. This is part of this piece, Burdocks, movement one, sub movement C. So I've done this with, again, with improvisers quite a bit. It's one of the first pieces I bring to improvisers if I'm trying to do kind of non-jazz improvisational techniques. So the basic idea is you split the group in half. Half of the group are fuses, half of the group are detonations. So the fuse group are playing basically some kind of a sound idea that's comparable to a sound of a fuse, just like a or some kind of like sustained sound, a tremolo on a guitar or a violin, a drum like a press roll and a snare drum, anything kind of like that. And then eventually ending the fuse sound. And then the group that's in the detonation end, their idea is they have to basically make explosions at the end of what they perceive to be a fuse stopping their sound. So you would have, for instance, like 5 people playing fuses of various lengths, and then 5 people who are listening for the fuses to end individually, and then trying to create an explosive sound at the end of it. And so one of the reasons Wolff writes pieces like this, not only, you know, to create these sort of social events, but he's also said that by creating these games and by creating these structures, you're basically creating a sound and a musical and rhythmic concept that's nearly impossible to actually notate with traditional notation. So that's one of the reasons why you would go into this world of like creating these text events or these miniature games, because at a certain point it's really difficult to write these things out and have the same sound with traditional notation. But if you just write out a couple of quick rules and have people follow that, then you can get all sorts of sort of indeterminate and open phrasing that, again, is really difficult to actually notate out. But also, this just makes a good listening exercise because you're kind of forcing half of the musicians to wait for other people to stop playing before you can play. And it's so I mean, geez, you could, I've never tried it, but you could probably do this with like middle schoolers or like definitely high schoolers, because it's just a very, very simple thing that they can, you know, play a long tone, and then once the long tone is over, play an explosion on your instrument. So, you know, young musicians would really, I'm sure, get a kick out of this. Pauline Oliveros, just very briefly, incredible improviser composer that passed away a few years ago. She has a massive collection of text scores. If you just do library searches or Google searches, you can find countless music scores. Yeah, she has this whole thing about 13 points for improvised music, but in her collections of text scores, they're usually only like 1 to 3 pages of information on playing a lot of this more intuitive music and open music. But that's just some really cool pointers that she has for playing improvised music. And with her kind of coming from like a non-jazz improvised music background, even though there's a lot of overlap obviously with playing jazz or even like kind of more of a free jazz style of music. Yeah, one of her pieces: find a sound that you like, find a way to express it. Pretty good piece. um, yeah, and then just quick overview, and that's all I've got for today. So it's just some different ideas you can get from the world of contemporary classical music. There's a million other scores like this out there. These are just some of the first ones that I go to try to work with improvisers on, or to try to present to improvising musicians. But there's all sorts of things with graphic scores, with musical games, with using text or text pieces, with notating ideas in a grid format. The idea of composing some music for a specific mood or gesture, even if it's very minimal, uh, to try to get improvisers to play in a certain way or style. Stopwatch timings, which, maybe that one's not as relevant, but it's just kind of fun to do, to try a different way to force yourself to play in a certain parameter. Uh, Very specific controlled dynamics, trying to improvise or compose music without thinking about melody, harmony, and rhythm. And then also asking yourself, well, what's left over when you don't have those ideas? um, as a composition or as improvisation. Are you playing a solo? Are you playing accompaniment? What role are you doing within this music? And this can be obviously traditional jazz or totally open free improvisation, but just, checking in with yourself to see where you're coming from. Creating some kind of music that has a malleable or open form composition or structure. One thing that I like to do for myself is even giving myself the idea of like, how open do I want it, or how through composed do I want it, and kind of looking at it as like a line between A and B. Do I want it to be completely through composed, no improvisation whatsoever, or do I want it to be totally open improvised, no rules whatsoever, and then moving around that dial of how far I want to go in each direction, um, for whatever it is I'm writing or working on. And then, yeah, using all sorts of various compositional frameworks and structures to form events and exercises for improvisers. And it can be any of these ideas as a single idea, it can be some kind of a combination of these ideas. But I mean, the whole thing is so wide open, there's so much you can do with it. So I just wanted to kind of present just a quick catch all for all these different things I went through today. I think that's it for me today, and yeah, thank you all for being here.